June 18, 1964. City Hall, Manhattan. Mayor Robert Wagner announced new anti-corruption task force. 20 federal agents. 50 NYPD detectives. Unlimited budget. Target: Harlem's numbers operation. The announcement was specific, aggressive, designed to dismantle what Wagner called the criminal infrastructure strangling our communities. Translation: shut down Bumpy Johnson's entire operation. Federal prosecutors projected success within 60 days. Police brass predicted arrests within weeks. Newspapers ran headlines about Harlem's coming liberation from organized crime. They assumed Harlem would welcome the intervention. Assumed residents wanted their neighborhood cleaned up. Assumed destroying the numbers operation would improve lives. They were wrong about everything. Bumpy Johnson made one phone call. For words to the right person. By midnight, Harlem had shut down completely. Not the criminal operations. Everything else. Legitimate businesses. Schools. Churches. Transportation. Services. The entire neighborhood stopped functioning. Not through violence. Through coordination. Through understanding that Harlem controlled Harlem, not City Hall. What happened over the next 16 days forced the mayor to negotiate. Forced the federal government to withdraw. Forced everyone who'd assumed they could dismantle Bumpy's operation to understand they'd miscalculated completely. This wasn't about crime. This was about who controlled a community. The numbers racket in 1964 Harlem wasn't just gambling. Was infrastructure, employment system, credit network, social service provider. The formal economy had failed Harlem. Banks wouldn't lend. Businesses wouldn't hire. Government services were inadequate or absent. The numbers filled that gap. Provided jobs for collectors. Created credit for small businesses. Offered financial services when legitimate institutions refused. Generated revenue that stayed in the community rather than flowing downtown. Bumpy Johnson didn't run the numbers like a criminal enterprise. Ran it like a shadow government. With systems. With accountability. With the kind of reliability that formal institutions failed to provide. Policy operators paid on time. Always. Winners received their money. Always. Disputes were mediated fairly. Always. The system worked because people trusted it more than they trusted official institutions that had consistently failed them. This trust was earned. Not through violence, though violence was available when needed. Through consistency. Through being present when government wasn't. Through providing structure in communities government had abandoned. Mayor Wagner's task force threatened all of this. 20 federal agents couldn't replace the infrastructure the numbers provided. 50 NYPD detectives couldn't provide the credit networks. Unlimited budgets couldn't recreate the employment system. The assumption was that Harlem would accept the disruption because the numbers were illegal. Because crime was bad. Because government intervention was help. This assumption ignored everything about how Harlem actually functioned. How communities operated when formal systems failed. How people survived when legitimate options didn't exist. Bumpy understood this completely. Understood that he wasn't just a criminal operator. Was a community institution. Was someone who provided services government promised but never delivered. Was infrastructure dressed as criminality. The federal task force's plan was thorough. Arrest key operators. Seize financial records. Prosecute aggressively. Create fear through visible enforcement. Break the operation through sustained pressure. Standard approach. Had worked other places. Different cities. Different operations. Should have worked in Harlem. Didn't account for one variable. What happened when the community chose its own institutions over government institutions? When residents decided they'd rather have the numbers than federal help. When Harlem itself became the resistance. Bumpy's response wasn't defensive. Wasn't about protecting his operation directly. Was about demonstrating what Harlem's cooperation with this task force would actually cost. About showing government officials what happened when they attacked community infrastructure without understanding its purpose. The phone call he made went to Reverend Samuel Brooks, senior minister at Abyssinian Baptist Church. most influential religious leader in Harlem. Man who could move the community with a single sermon. For words, time to show them. That was June 18th. By June 19th, Harlem had stopped. June 19th, Thursday. Normal workday. Except in Harlem, nothing was normal. Buses ran. But nobody boarded. Drivers showed up. Routes were driven. But Harlem residents stayed home. Hundreds of empty buses rolling through the neighborhood all day. Stores opened. But nobody shopped. Owners unlocked doors. Turned on lights. Sat waiting for customers who didn't come. Even grocery stores stood empty. People ate what they had. Bought nothing new. Schools operated. But students stayed home. 70% attendance drop overnight. Teachers came to work. Taught empty classrooms. Principals couldn't explain it. Parents offered no excuses. Churches held services. Attendance tripled. Reverend Brooks preached about community self-determination. About external forces disrupting internal peace. About the importance of standing together. The message was subtle. The response was clear. By Friday, city officials noticed. Called it coincidence. Temporary anomaly. Weather-related maybe. Couldn't acknowledge the obvious. Harlem was staging coordinated resistance. Federal agents began their raids Friday afternoon. Arrested 3 policy operators. Seized records from 2 locations. Held press conference announcing significant progress. Saturday, Harlem's shutdown intensified. Sanitation workers called in sick. City employees who lived in Harlem didn't show up downtown. Delivery drivers refused Harlem routes. Not through threats, through collective decision. Sunday's church services became organizing meetings. Reverend Brooks spoke for 2 hours. About dignity. About community control. About outside forces that claim to help while actually disrupting. About the numbers operation providing services government promised and never delivered. The sermon was broadcast on local radio. Reached every Harlem household. The message was clear without being explicit. The shutdown continues until the task force withdraws. Monday morning, the mayor's office received 400 phone calls. Business owners complaining about lost revenue. Transit officials reporting empty buses. School administrators dealing with mass absences. All from Harlem. All coordinated. Federal prosecutors noticed. Their raids had produced arrests. But something else was happening. Something larger. Something they hadn't planned for. City Hall called a meeting. Mayor Wagner. Police commissioner. Federal prosecutors. Transit officials. Business representatives. They reviewed the situation. Tried to understand what they were seeing. It's a strike, someone said. Community-wide strike. Against what? Against us. Against the task force. Against disrupting their system. The numbers operation is illegal. They don't care. They care that it works. That it provides services we don't. That we're attacking something they rely on. The mayor was trapped. He'd announced the task force publicly. Promised results. Had federal support. But the community response was paralyzing the entire neighborhood. Making the task force look like occupying force rather than helping hand. Tuesday, the federal agents tried to continue operations. Arrested more operators. Seized more records. But each arrest made the shutdown worse. Made Harlem more united. Made the resistance more complete. Newspapers downtown started asking questions. Why was Harlem shutting down? Why were residents not cooperating? Why did a criminal investigation produce community resistance instead of community support? Some journalists got it. Wrote stories about the numbers operation as community service. About the gap between formal economy and actual community needs. About government assuming cooperation without understanding context. Other journalists didn't get it. Wrote about criminals manipulating innocent residents. About intimidation. About fear forcing cooperation. These stories made the situation worse. Made Harlem residents angrier. Made the shutdown more determined. By Wednesday, businesses outside Harlem were feeling impact. Delivery drivers wouldn't go in. Suppliers couldn't reach stores. Services were disrupted. The economic isolation was cutting both ways. Thursday morning, City Hall received call from Business Coalition. Downtown merchants who relied on Harlem customers. Suppliers who served Harlem stores. They wanted the task force withdrawn. Wanted normal operations restored. Wanted the mayor to negotiate. Wagner resisted. Federal prosecutors insisted they could break the resistance through more arrests. Police brass promised results if given more resources. But Friday proved them wrong. The shutdown was now in its second week. Nothing had broken. No cracks in community solidarity. No informants coming forward. No cooperation with investigators. Instead, the shutdown had spread. Now included some government services. Postal workers in Harlem slowed deliveries. Municipal employees found reasons to delay. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be punished. Just calculated slowness that multiplied into significant disruption. Saturday, June 27th. 9 days into the shutdown, Mayor Wagner requested private meeting with Reverend Brooks. Not official. No press. No record. Just conversation between two power brokers. They met at the church. Wagner came alone. No security. No staff. This itself was significant. Was acknowledgement that official power was asking unofficial power for terms. This has to end, Wagner said. It will, when the task force withdraws. I can't just withdraw. I made public commitment. Then you'll have public failure. Harlem can maintain this indefinitely. Can you? Wagner understood the mathematics. Every day the shutdown continued, his political capital eroded. Business pressure increased. Media questions intensified. What had been presented as helping Harlem was being revealed as attacking Harlem. The numbers operation is illegal. So is the informal credit system. So are the unlicensed businesses. So are dozen other things people do to survive when legitimate options fail them. You gonna shut down all of that? The law assumes people have alternatives. Harlem doesn't. Banks won't lend here. Businesses won't hire here. Your government services are inadequate here. The numbers fill that gap. You shut it down. What replaces it? Wagner had no answer. The task force hadn't planned for replacement services. Hadn't considered that dismantling criminal infrastructure without providing alternative infrastructure just created chaos. I need something, Wagner said. Can't just withdraw without getting something. Brooks considered. You can announce review of services in Harlem. Commitment to address economic gaps. Promise to study why residents rely on informal systems. Frame withdrawal as strategic rather than defeated. Will Bumpy accept that? Bumpy doesn't need acceptance. He needs the task force gone. You give him that, he gives you face-saving exit. And the shutdown ends? Immediately. Wagner sat quietly, processing, understanding he was negotiating with a community that had demonstrated more unity and determination than he'd imagined possible, that had shut down an entire neighborhood through coordination rather than coercion, that had proven itself capable of sustained resistance. One more thing, Wagner said. The federal agents. They answer to Washington, not me. How do I explain their withdrawal? Tell Washington the community response makes their mission impossible. Tell them continuing just creates martyrs and strengthens what they're trying to weaken. Tell them Harlem's resistance is teaching other communities that organized opposition works. This was the key point. If Harlem succeeded, other communities would learn. Would understand that coordinated resistance could force government retreat. Would recognize that communities could defend their own institutions even when those institutions were technically illegal. Wagner left without making commitment. But Brooks knew he would comply. The mayor had no choice. The pressure was too great. The political cost too high. Monday morning, Wagner held press conference. Announced strategic pause in task force operations. Promised comprehensive review of community services in Harlem. Committed to addressing root causes of informal economic systems. Didn't use word withdrawal. Didn't admit defeat. But the task force stopped operations. Federal agents were reassigned. NYPD detectives returned to normal duties. By Monday afternoon, Harlem had reopened. Buses filled with passengers. Stores welcomed customers. Schools restored normal attendance. Services resumed. The shutdown ended as quickly as it started. No celebration. No victory declaration. Just return to normal. The message had been sent. The lesson had been taught. The point had been made. The numbers operation continued. Unchanged. Unmolested. For 4 more years until Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. After that, the structure gradually fractured. Not from government pressure. From loss of the organizational genius who'd made it work. Mayor Wagner never attempted another task force in Harlem. Never tried to shut down the numbers again. The political lesson was permanent. Communities that organized could resist even when government had law on its side. The federal government studied the Harlem shutdown, analyzed how it happened, how complete community cooperation was achieved, how sustained resistance was maintained. The analysis was classified, but the conclusions filtered through law enforcement. Attacking community institutions, even illegal ones, required understanding what those institutions provided and offering genuine alternatives. Reverend Brooks never admitted his role, never confirmed the meeting with Wagner, never acknowledged coordinating the shutdown. Didn't need to. Everyone who mattered knew. His influence in Harlem increased. His political leverage with City Hall became permanent. Bumpy Johnson never discussed the shutdown publicly, made no statements, claimed no victory, just continued operations as before. The forward phone call was never confirmed, but everyone understood it had happened. Understood that Bumpy had made one move that defeated an entire government operation. The shutdown itself became case study. Civil rights organizations analyzed it. Community organizers studied it. Political scientists wrote papers about it. How do you resist when you can't protest? How do you fight when violence is an option? How do you demonstrate power when you lack formal authority? Harlem had answered, coordinate, unify, show what cooperation looks like and what its absence costs. Demonstrate that community solidarity can defeat legal authority when that authority lacks community support. Other neighborhoods learned. Other communities facing similar situations studied Harlem's model. Some attempted their own versions. Success varied. But the principle was established. Communities weren't helpless against government action if they organized effectively. The specific tactics became template. Selective shutdown of cooperation. Continuing legitimate activities but withholding participation. Maintaining peace while demonstrating power. Making the cost of government action exceed any benefit. City Hall changed approach to Harlem after 1964. Became more consultative, more careful, more aware that governing required cooperation and cooperation required understanding community perspective, even when that perspective involved technically illegal operations. The numbers operation eventually ended. Not from raids, not from arrests, from changing economics, from better banking access, from more legitimate employment, from community development that made informal systems less necessary. But that took decades, and happened through evolution, not enforcement. The 16-day shutdown in June 1964 proved something significant. Proved that communities could defend their own institutions, could resist government power, could force negotiation even when lacking formal authority, could demonstrate that legitimacy came from community acceptance, not legal status. Bumpy Johnson's genius wasn't the numbers operation itself. Was understanding that the operation served community needs. That protecting it required demonstrating what its loss would mean. That government could be forced to retreat if community showed unified willingness to pay the cost of resistance. One phone call. For words. 16 days. Complete victory. They thought Harlem would collapse overnight. Thought attacking the numbers would be welcomed. Thought community would cooperate with its own liberation. Instead, Harlem showed them what actual community power looked like. What organized resistance achieved. What happened when a neighborhood decided its own institutions mattered more than government approval. Bumpy Johnson shut it down in one move. Not through violence, through understanding, through coordination, through making one phone call that activated a community. That was power, real power, the kind that governments couldn't defeat because it was based on community consent rather than force. The kind that lasted long after the man who wielded it was gone.